Welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast, produced by Zero Cliff Media. Coming to you from the US Bank Tower, high above downtown Los Angeles. In our podcast, we drill deep into forensics and criminal investigation from the viewpoint of the defense, as well as explore the intersection of the media and the justice system.
I'm Dion Mitchell here with Mehul Anjaria. Today we present our third episode in our Celebrity Justice Warrior series. We previously covered Ice-T and Kim Kardashian West, and today we are excited to talk about Robert Rameek Williams, better known as the Philly rapper Meek Mill.
Meek Mill may not be as well known in the mainstream as Ice-T is or Kim Kardashian West, but his legal saga and the attention it's brought to criminal justice reform and the system itself has been extremely high profile the last few years.
Okay, so before we move on, I already know that you're a fan riding around with you in LA.
Yeah, that's right,
so
yeah.
Let's just go right to what's your favorite album or albums.
Okay, well, I do have a few Meek Mill albums, and I can remember, his breakthrough album was Dreams and Nightmares that came out about 2012. And I can remember wearing that one out. So that's probably about the time that you were riding with me hearing that. And that album was released when he teamed with Rick Ross's Maybach music group. And at that time, he was blowing up. He had done a song with Mariah Carey. I remember. Album was big, right? And the album cover for Dreams and Nightmare has a very profound image on it. And that is a handcuff connected to a gold watch, presumably a Rolex. That has a couple of meanings, I believe. One is that it's a reflection of Meek Mill's life because he had been in the criminal justice system, the handcuff, and he'd been at the top of his game making money and having a great career, the Rolex. The other message there is that if you are in the dope game and after the fast money and the Rolexes, you are inextricably linked to the possibility of being incarcerated and thus the handcuff. So, ironically, before Meek Mill signed with Rick Ross, he had originally signed with the rapper T.I. But, 2010, 2011, T.I. had his own legal troubles and was in prison twice. So it's kind of hard to manage an artist when you're in prison.
Yeah. I'm sure T.I. is going to show up in one of our future podcast episodes, that's for sure. But we'll table him for now. And before we move on, let's get into the criminal justice journey or nightmare for Meek and talk about his current work. And one of those being the Reform Alliance, which is it's a group of some high profile people that created the Reform Alliance, and it aims to reduce the number of people affected by parole and probation law by 1 million over the next 5 years. This is 2/3, which is just unbelievable. 2/3 of the population in the criminal justice system.
Yeah. So just to follow up on that, some of the names involved, Meek Mill, of course, but Jay-Z, Van Jones, whose name seems to pop up in all of these reform organizations.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but he seemed to be a real centerpiece of all this action.
He does indeed. And I think that he's sort of the head of this Reform Alliance. And now you've got the money people as well. So you've got the part owner of the Sixers, Michael Rubin. And interestingly, you've got Robert Kraft, who could be a podcast episode as well.
On his own as well. Yeah, he's the owner of the Patriots.
That's right. And so, you gave some statistics there that were kind of chilling. And to put them in perspective, you figure you got 6 million people in the criminal justice system today. Of that 6 million, 4 million are on probation or parole, meaning they're potentially teetering on being incarcerated.
Yeah, and you have a front row seat for this. I mean, you deal with these guys on a daily basis.
Yeah, and and a theme here that we're going to talk about, particularly with Meek Mill, is that his probation kept getting extended and extended and extended. So if you are on probation for 10 years, particularly when you're a young man, it doesn't take much for them to violate you. So it could be a very minor infraction, and then you're right back in the system. So that's why we need some reform here.
Exactly. So I guess before we go forward, you got to always go back and say, okay, well, how do we get here? So I'll break that down so everybody that's listening understands why we're featuring him and what this is all about. So in 2007, a police officer named Reginald Graham, who worked with the Philadelphia Narcotics Unit, claimed to have seen Robert Williams, who was still a teenager and wasn't yet Meek Mill, selling crack cocaine. The next day, when Graham and another officer approached Williams, Meek Mill, while he walked from a relative's home to a local store, accounts given by the officers at the time alleged that Williams pulled out a gun and pointed it at them. When Williams attempted to run, the officers caught up to him. Williams was struck by the officers and appears injured in the mugshot taken at the time. Officers have said the injuries were the result of him resisting arrest. But Meek's account of the events are actually a lot different. He doesn't deny having a gun, but says he never pointed at the cops and insisted he ditched it when officers approached. Meek also argued that the officers used excessive force by using his head as a battering ram to gain entry into a relative's home. In fact, Meek told Billboard in 2015 that he had a concussion, stitches, and his braids were ripped out.
Wow.
And he said his blood was all over the ceiling and the floor.
So it's a little bit hard to piece together exactly what went down with the arrest. But based on some further information I saw, it seems like the cops see Meek Mill potentially dealing crack. As a result of that, they get a search warrant. So the following day, while they're serving the search warrant, this is where the events go down that you described. So what's at issue here? It's not an issue that Meek Mill had a gun. Okay, he would admit that. The question is, did he pull it and point it at the officers, which really raises the stakes.
That's right. That's right.
And, listen, if he's pointing a gun at officers, then some degree of violence is going to go down. There's no doubt about it. But what Meek Mill is claiming is that he had the gun, but he took it out to ditch it. In other words, to try to hide it. So that's a whole different ballgame there.
Yeah, a lot of times, you don't know, if the officer has had a previous run-in or if there's some kind of vendetta. But these things, in split seconds can go off the rails. But let's get into the officer,
right,
which has a whole set of his own issues. So the guy that arrested Meek Mill in 2007 had his own, like I said, issues and problems. And the Philly District Attorney's Office put him on a do not call list. What is a do not call list? It was a secret list of suspect cops who shouldn't be called on to testify in court cases because they have a history of dishonest behavior or racial bias.
Oh, man.
The list says that Graham was investigated by federal authorities for several alleged acts of corruption. So this is just, another spin on this, on this arrest and the beginning of this kind of long journey in the justice system for Meek Mill.
Yeah, so we'll come back to that and we'll talk about the potential legitimacy of the original arrest. But just we talked about going in order. I just want to go back really quick. And I want to talk about when Meek Mill was last released from prison. So that was in April of 2018, just about a year ago. And this was in very dramatic fashion. So the Pennsylvania Supreme Court finally granted him bail, and he was released after a 5-month stint in prison. And so what happens is he's released from jail. He's immediately picked up in a helicopter, and he's riding with the Philadelphia 76ers co-owner Michael Rubin. They whisk him off to the 76ers game that night, and he takes place in the pregame ceremony of ringing the Liberty Bell at the Philadelphia game.
I remember that. I remember at the time not necessarily watching that because I don't think anybody knew that was going to happen. But
right.
Just watching the game, being an NBA fan, and seeing this go on, and then kind of going online and finding what it was about. But it was a pretty dramatic situation.
So this just shows how the Meek Mill story really peaked in the mainstream. Well, I shouldn't say peaked, was prominent in the mainstream last year and is continuing to go on. So now let's pick up kind of on where you left off in the story. So he gets arrested in 2007, okay? So now let's look at the procedural history and his journey through the justice system. Based on that first arrest, Meek Mill was sentenced in 2008 to between 11 and 23 months in prison. And he ended up serving 5 months of that and then was granted house arrest and put on probation for 5 years. So as we said earlier, this is the time period now where his career is starting to blow up. And so everything is seems to be on the up and up with his arrest and all that, considering that it was not yet known about the original officer's corruption.
Like you said, his career is really starting to take off, and then trouble starts again. On Halloween in 2012, he's pulled over, and the cops believe they smell marijuana. Meek is allegedly arrested because he refuses to allow the cop to search his car. More trouble in 2014 when Meek becomes a victim of his own success. He's touring, the country, and apparently he doesn't get the judge to co-sign on his travel. And of course, I don't know too many judges that like that.
No. And honestly, that was the last straw in the judge's eye. So she ends up sentencing him to 3 to 6 months in jail. And after that, he was put on parole, and he was ordered to complete etiquette classes. And I know there were some issues with maybe some tweets about his probation officer or the judge or things like that. And we're going to talk about the judge in a little bit, because that weighs very heavily on the controversy in this case.
Right. And so now going forward in 2016, where the wheels really start to fall off for Meek Mill, he gets in trouble for 3 minor infractions: traveling without permission, a scuffle at the St. Louis airport after he refuses to take a picture with an employee, and then finally, most incredibly, popping a wheelie.
Yeah, so this is the famous wheelie that basically lands him in prison. And according to Meek Mill's attorney, Joe Tacopina, I'll just read a quote here. "A guy literally popped a wheelie for 10 seconds on the street with no one else around. And the police were there. That's very important. The police were there and they saw it and they didn't arrest him. They didn't even give him a traffic ticket, but somehow the video made it to social media." So that's very interesting. The cops didn't bust him. Somebody saw this video on social media. It got to the judge and he had to pay the price. So in November 2017, she slapped him with a sentence of 2 to 4 years in prison for those probation violations.
Yeah, see, for me, this is where, for people that like the justice system and all this is where the system and this particular judge starts to lose credibility. I mean, you're losing people starting to jump off ship. And, to some, this seems logical. And this guy's, given a ton of chances, but neither of the prosecutors or the probation officer recommended prison. In fact, the charges surrounding the airport scuffle and the wheelie popping incident basically had been dropped.
Right. So whatever you think about Meek Mill's behavior, the actual grounds for him being handed down such a severe sentence are very questionable. Now, let's look at this whole process. You mentioned we had problems with the arresting officer in 2007, but now let's talk about the judge. So here are the allegations about the judge, Judge Brinkley. And I believe her first name is Janice. So the allegation is that she was basically starstruck or obsessed with Meek Mill. So at one point, he was doing community service at a homeless shelter, and she showed up, which is really highly irregular for a judge to do. She also supposedly tried to get him to leave his management company, Rock Nation, so that he could sign with a company that a friend of hers was involved in. And maybe most ridiculously, the allegation goes that she asked him to cover a Boys to Men song and give her a shout out in that song.
So for me here, I'm sure there was more before this, but at this part of the story, this is where the wheels fall off for the judge. Because now I think at first she's just trying to follow the letter of the law and the rulings, but then you start hearing this and you're going, what's going on here? What kind of issues does she have?
Absolutely. Well, there's more. So here, now going back to Officer Graham, who was one of the arresting officers in 2007, there's a bunch of cases where he testified in trial that they were going to look at. And all of those cases, Meek Mill should have been one of them, were transferred to another judge. When I say all the cases, all except for one, Meek Mill's case. So why is that? The judge does not want to give up this case. She just does not want to recuse herself, no matter how much of these bad facts come up. And then on top of that, the defense team did some research, and they found that this judge, Judge Brinkley, had filed a number of civil lawsuits in her personal life. And the most recent one was in April 2018. This was surrounding a car accident. And she was stating that, she had emotional distress, severe injuries, and was affected to the point where she couldn't properly do her job. Well, by her own words, then, she probably shouldn't be overseeing Meek Mill's case or anybody else's.
Yeah, it starts to sound like this is stalking from the bench.
Yes.
I mean, it's starting to get a little, like a made for Lifetime movie.
Well, wouldn't that be an ironic twist? We were executive producers on a show called Stalker Files. That was on Reels. How about this for a twist where the judge is the stalker? I mean, I see a season 2 there.
Yeah. Oh, man. So to round out the story, given everything that transpired in Meek's case, even the DA did not oppose Meek being released on bail.
Yeah, so he's sitting there in prison, and not even the DA wants him there. So clearly we have a abuse of discretion here. And so this is the whole problem with the probation and parole, that one little act could land you back, but it's highly discretionary based on the judge. Here, the DA and the probation officer did not recommend that he go to prison. And we also had, the issue with the arresting officer. But now check this out, right? Meek Mill, he's got the benefit of money and prominent attorneys, and this still happened to him. Because we always talk about how money can equalize the justice system.
That's right.
But not always. So what if Meek Mill's not Meek Mill rap star with money and career? What if he's regular Joe Blow? So, yeah.
Well, he's still locked up. That's one. But money can't buy you out of someone stalking you from the bench.
Exactly. So money cannot necessarily fix corruption, although it can help you investigate it better. And that may be why Meek Mill's defense team got to the bottom of it, because he did have money to pay for someone to really go hard and investigate. But now here's another issue. Joe Blow is probably still sitting in prison, but here's the thing, right? With Meek Mill going in and out of prison, hey, listen, that took away his liberty. That affected his career, but, at least he had a career. What about the guy who goes to jail for whatever? He's out on probation. And while he's on probation, he's trying to make his life right. He's trying to get a job. And let's say they violate him on a ticky-tacky technical issue. Like maybe he couldn't get the city bus in time, so he couldn't go meet with his probation officer. Well, now if he goes back to jail, he's done, right? Whatever progress he made on getting his life together has now been knocked away by him going to jail. So how's he ever going to get himself right? Meek Mill could get his career right. He had that benefit. Joe Blow can't.
Right. And this is, for me, this is really comes down to the heart of the matter, is where the reform needs to take place, because you're right. It's like, we talked about it with the 3 strikes law. You go there, you get a DUI, you're locked up for the rest of your life. Then there's the small ticky-tack parole violation. You're back in prison for 10 years, just when you're getting your life turned around. And obviously there's a ton of political spin on this, local political spin on this. But I hope going forward that his case is a tipping point, because whether you like him, you don't like him, you agree with the decisions he's made, or don't agree, or with the judge or the corrupt cop, that this needs to be changed. We cannot, just for the dollars alone, we cannot go forward with the current system that we have. And it seems like time and time again, when these high profile cases, they make it up into the bloodstream and everybody's aware of it, then something gets done. So I'm hoping that this particular case, his case, is another one of those examples.
So, America has the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world. So when we talk about law and order, what are we talking about? Does that mean criminalizing even more behavior so that if you're busted with a tiny amount of marijuana when you're in probation, you go back to prison? And then we fill up the prisons and it's economic and people's lives aren't turned around and it's a whole big issue. So, we talk in this podcast about the intersection of criminal justice and entertainment and the media. So what a better case than Meek Mill? I mean, while he was in prison, you had the hashtag Freak Mill. Hashtag free. Okay, restart. Hashtag free Meek Mill campaign. Right. So a bunch of celebrities and rappers were getting on board, and they weren't just bringing attention to Meek Mill's plight. It became much bigger than that. They were calling attention to the reforms.
Well, that's what I mean.
Needed.
Kind of like this is where that's that tipping point. So like I say, whether you agree or disagree with what he did, that hopefully this is a tipping point. And when you get, the owner of the Sixers and the Patriots involved, who, I mean, I was reading some articles where, he went in to see him in prison and he goes, I couldn't sleep for 2 or 3 days after that.
Yeah, exactly. You know what? I always harp on this, but you have to go to understand this. You have to go see somebody in jail and humanize them and see what they're really like. So it's very easy from the outside to look at stats and make judgments, but you have to remember that you're dealing with a human life, and then what our rules and laws do to our society as a whole. So are we really getting vengeance, or are we shooting ourselves in the foot and messing up our society?
Yeah, I think that goes to kind of like the seeing is believing. A lot of people, they're in their jets, they're living their life, but until they go see this, they really don't understand. Do you remember, this is a little bit of a kind of a crazy Ivan here, but do you remember when we were filming the sizzle reel for Equal Justice, and we were at Men's Central Jail downtown, and we had our producer with us, and he was actually from New York. So he, I believe, Brooklyn, and went to St. John's, and, so you think he'd be kind of maybe a little bit hardened. So we take him up there, and they had a couple of inmates changing the flag, and we're getting to the front door, and he was visibly shaken. I mean, how intimidating just the outside of this building is, let alone, and we didn't even go inside that day.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, you guys just got a flavor. And I remember you guys commenting as we pulled up, it's like, wow, this is getting real. I mean, even just going in the parking garage, seeing the door, and like you say, seeing some inmates, it got real. So now you talked about the Reform Alliance. So what are they doing now? Well, just recently they announced that they are proposing legislation for parole and probation reform. And the gist of it is that they want to reward good behavior as well. And they want to stop all these violations for these technical issues. Stuff like, a little bit of marijuana, not documenting your travel plans, or associating with criminals. And, look at that last one, right? Again, this depends where you grew up at. If I live in a particular neighborhood, it's going to be pretty hard for me to not associate with criminals or gang members purely by my geography. So, Reform Alliance, they're working with legislators in Philly, and they're trying to get this passed. So they're very active. And I think that all of the spotlight and publicity of Meek Mill has went to a greater good, and the reform continues. I
agree. It's I didn't really know what to expect when we decided to do this series. And this whole celebrity justice warrior, these podcasts have been really eye-opening for us, probably more so than me than for you. But I really hope it's eye-opening for our listeners. And there are a lot more that we can cover, and we will. And we'll definitely jump back in down the road in the future. So hopefully everybody finds this entertaining, and maybe, through social media, they tell us if they have a case that we're not aware of, that they send it to us. And if you like what we're doing, be sure to give us some love on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Crime Redefined.
Okay, and we'll talk to you in the next episode.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mehul.
Thank you for listening to the Crime Redefined podcast. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Crime Redefined. Please send us your comments and questions and join us for the next episode.